I'm Rachel, and this is my video for the 2019 BookTube SFF Awards. And of course I'm getting this out later than I hoped to. Of course I am. I'm getting this out on the morning my time, which is Eastern Standard in the US, of the final day of voting. That would be February 11th. So hopefully this video will do some good and maybe encourage some people to go to the polls, which I will link down below, but for the most part it'll be informative and fun. The BookTube SFF Awards are in their 5th year, and this is my 2nd year of participating. I'll link my last year video down below too. This is put on by our very own BookTube SFF community, where the judges come from, and the administrator, Elizabeth, at Books and Pieces. They have Hugo Styles awards for varying categories in science fiction and fantasy, ranging from Best Fantasy and Best Science Fiction Adult, for children's and YA groups, and into short fiction and graphic novels. So last year I actually, for the very first time, read more science fiction and fantasy than any other genre in my reading. But that being said, I still read predominantly backlist, and I only have a very few amount of titles to choose from for these awards. And I also only have titles to choose from in 4 categories, in Best Fantasy, Best Science Fiction, and then Best Young Adult, and then also Best Debut. What can I say? I guess I don't necessarily fit the mold, and I feel like my reasons for these books are also a little bit strange, but I'll get to them as I explain my nominees. So my pick for Best Fantasy Novel is Fire Dance by Ilana C. Meyer. She's calling it a standalone novel, though technically it's pretty connected to her previous novel, Last Song Before Night. And it seems like it'll slip quite quickly and easily into her 2020 novel, The Poet King. So this novel takes place in an epic fantasy land where the main character from the last novel, Lynn, who is a poet and now is the court poet for her people, is called forth to a neighboring land to help settle a dispute where these people called fire dancers are using magic to fight the neighbors, or so it seems. There's certainly some plots within plots going on, and a big baddie who remains at large throughout Fire Dance and is set up to continue his reign in The Poet King. And if all of that sounds a little vague, well, I don't actually remember the plot all that well, which is really not the best sign, I guess, for picking a best in anything. But one reason I decided to pick this book, besides the fact that I do have limited options available to myself, is the writing was so evocative. There's just a poetry when you read it, and it feels like you're stepping into a mythological sort of world. It feels like fantasy. It feels like magic, beyond the stereotypical environs of a Bronze Age empire or what have you. And as I read this book and the first one, I remember being swept away. And my goal, certainly, for when the 3rd book comes out next year, I hope, is that I will read the 3 books back to back, and certainly I hope that will keep the plot more firmly in my head. I know this stands little to no chance of making the shortlist for the year, but I am curious because I know that Thomas at SFF 180 read and reviewed Last Song Before Night, so I do wish I could hear his thoughts on Fire Dance as well. My pick for Best Science Fiction Novel is A Record of a Spaceborne Few by Becky Chambers, which technically she also calls a standalone book, but also it's known as the 3rd book in the Wayfarer series. I kind of think that authors are trying to have their cake and eat it too with this whole idea of, no, really, you can read them alone, but they always read better in a series. So this book takes place in the universe, or technically galaxy, that Chambers set up in her previous 2 books, where in the distant future, humans, who have all left the dying Earth by this point, have found alien contact and for the most part have started to colonize or settle on alien lands. but this book in particular focuses on the human fleet. That is a collection of spaceships which had its mission when it set off from Earth to go forth and find a new home. But now, even though they've found new places, new planets and to colonize and new aliens to interact with, they still live in their fleet and they still sort of live by the rules of their community for the most part. And Chambers is following various characters who are part of this one ship in the fleet and about what comprises their lives. And somewhat the opposite of Fire Dance, which I remember for being fantastical, this book technically isn't hugely focused on science fiction elements. I mean, yes, technically it takes place in outer space and there are aliens and future technology and all of that, but that's not really the point of this novel. If you strip away all of that stuff, you could set it basically in any historical period on Earth. Because this is really a novel about a group of people whose way of life has largely become obsolete, but they still find meaning in their community and are trying to hold on to why. It's a very character-driven story. There's not a whole lot of plot involved, and it turns some people off. But for me, this book touched me the most deeply. It was my favorite, and it was for basically non-science fiction reasons. I mean, I loved all of the allusions to the sci-fi stuff, but what really touched me deeply was this exploration of a community of human beings trying to remain true to themselves, even though the mores of society around them have shifted. And I'm not sure how this book will do in the shortlist. My first thought would be that of course it would make it on because, well, the first book in particular, A Long Way to a Strong, Angry Planet, was hugely popular in the science fiction world and beyond. But I wonder, as we're getting to book 3, if some of the magic, as it were, has worn off and people are more interested in other books and other stories. So I guess I'll find out. I think this has a decently good chance of making the shortlist, but I don't know. My gut is telling me it's not, 100% in the bag. My favorite YA SFF book that came out in 2018 is A Reaper at the Gates by Sabaa Tahir. This is book 3 in what she definitely just calls a series that began with An Ember in the Ashes, which was hugely popular. It takes place in an epic fantasy land where the society is vaguely modeled after ancient Rome with some Middle Eastern magical influences. Our main characters are Laia, who is a scholar rebel, and Helene, who is now known as the Blood Shrike and is very high up in the martial army system, military system. And then Elias, who used to be part of that martial system, but is now a mythological creature in his own right who is ferrying souls from the world of the living to the world of the dead when they die, or at least that's what he's supposed to be doing. In the beginning of this book, he's still much more interested in what's going on with the human travails. But as the book goes on, he interacts the most with the magical components, which are slowly inching their way into this series through Jinn and a broader backstory about the scholars and their bad behavior several generations back that have put them in a bad situation right now. And we learn much more about our main villain, the Nightbringer, who vows a sort of fantastical revenge on his foes throughout the ages. But the human characters are also in a bit of a bind. The Martial Empire is rather brutal in its own way to all of its neighbors, especially to the scholars, and it is run by some unsavory characters like the Emperor Marcus Farrar and the very slippery Cersei Lannister-esque character of the Commandant. And Helene, I can't call her the Blood Shrike, but I still find her the most fascinating character, I guess, because she's very human in how she's caught between a rock and a hard place. She hates the Emperor, but her sister's also his wife. And she tries to be a good person, but she also believes in the propaganda that's been sold to her throughout her life. And she's also just a character who often, despite her best attempts to stay one step ahead of her political enemies, finds herself falling behind. But she gets some victories in there as well. And so does Laia, who I think, as she becomes a leader, is slowly coming into her own and is hopefully becoming a more interesting character than a lot of people found her in the first two books. But anyway, this is supposed to be a four-part series, so we are really ramped up at the end of this book for the finale, where the might of the humans and the magical world might finally get to clash most directly. It's a really riveting read with really complex characters. It's what I really like about it. I'll say really a lot more times. But again, I'm not quite sure how it'll do for the shortlist. I haven't heard about it as much in all of the buzz about YA fiction. Because again, you know, there's always so many new properties being churned out in YA fantasy and sci-fi. So maybe An Ember in the Ashes and the whole series is a little past its prime. But I certainly loved it, and in this category I read a couple of other properties that came out, other books that came out in 2018. And this is the last year that I can even nominate it, because as per the rules we can only nominate up to book 3. So this is my final hurrah and pat on the back for the Ember in the Ashes series, which I think continues to remain strong. And finally, in Best Debut Fiction, I decided to go for Beneath the Haunting Sea by Joanna Ruth Meyer. And this might be a little unfair of me because I technically know the author, although I really don't know her that well. This isn't too much of favoritism going on here. And besides, I really loved this book. This is a young adult epic fantasy novel about Talia, who with her mother is banished from her exotic empirical capital and sent to live in England, like Rainy Island, as it were, on the outskirts of the empire. Her mother, on the journey there, starts to hear voices from the sea and ultimately jumps to her death. And when Talia gets to her new home, she finds a library, and she finds a couple of hunky guys and is able to unfurl the mystery of the gods about what happened to her mother and what she should do to save her mother's spirit and other spirits from a vengeful goddess. There's a lot I really liked about this book. I could nitpick a little bit at the YA cliche romance stuff, but in terms of world building, it was lush and lyrical. It focused a lot on the power of story and on music and the arts, and less so on like badass, kick-ass heroines, which it's my personal pet peeve. I think those are a little bit overdone. I'm just kind of sick of the focus on the action and the martial stuff, I guess, unless it's An Ember in the Ashes series, and I love it there. But this is something new, and as part of nominating for the Best Debut Novel, I think I'm nominating for the promise of an interesting new voice in the future. And certainly as I was reading this book, one of the big things I could think about was how much I was intrigued by the broader world building that she was doing. You know, we start out in this exotic capital of the empire, and we end in, you know, the outskirts, but I was thinking, well, what else can we learn about this empire, and what's going on with the history and the future and the culture of all of this? And lo and behold, Meyer will be publishing a companion book, Beyond the Shadowed Earth, that I believe will be coming out again in 2020. So maybe yet again I will reread this book before reading that one. But I think it'll be much of the same, and Meyer already has out another book, Echo North, which is a fairy tale retelling, and it also focuses a lot on myth and story and music. So I recommend her for something fun and fresh in YA fantasy. I don't think this book will make it at all onto the shortlist, but I'm going to prop it up here and now. So that about covers it for me now. Again, the nomination period is ending today on the 11th, and then on the 18th the judges will announce the shortlists in all of the categories based on our votes, the most popular of our votes. And then, as I understand it, throughout the spring they will be hosting read-alongs of the various books and so forth that we can take part in. I don't know if I'm going to take part in it because I already have so much that I want to read. but I definitely think I'll keep my eye out for recommendations of things that might pique my interest in the future. And then I believe we will culminate and end with the judges and the readers picking their top favorites in June in a big live show, which was really fun to watch in years past. I'm sure will be fun to watch again. Because what's really cool about this prize, and so many prizes, is not only celebrating SFF literature, but celebrating it with the community. And BookTube is my community, and I watch a lot of these BookTube SFF people throughout the year. And I'm excited to celebrate everything that came out in 2018 with them, the best of the best. Hopefully, anyway. So that about wraps it up for me. Happy reading, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.